Make sure that you type any questions you may have here on the group chat. Okay, so let us begin. All right. Um, when we start talking about Rome, and again, if you all remember from the previous conversation that we had the last time, the Roman Republic itself is kind of the result of this fear of tyranny. If you remember, the original city town of Rome itself was actually a monarchy, all right, where an Etruscan king had been ruling the city of Rome for quite some time until eventually the last Etruscan king is overthrown because of a controversy involving his son. And so the Romans, hoping to avoid this, eventually decide to essentially remove the king and establish a republic. Now, remember, when we talk about a republic, we're not talking about the traditional monarchical sense of a republic where you have universal representation and et cetera, et cetera. This is a very, very limited republic where only a small portion of individuals, particularly males that own land, are involved in this particular form of government. Now, since the beginning of the Republic, and even going on until the further imperial age, you can kind of divide Roman society between two particular powers, two particular classes, the plebeians and the patricians. Now, the easiest way to define each of these categories are the patricians are the wealthy landowners. You know, if you know the English word patron or the Spanish word patron, this is where this word comes from, right? The patricians are the landowners. The patricians are the ones with the finances. They control, as we'll talk, as later historians will mention this, the means of production. Now, the plebeians are the public. They're the general commoners. You know, they usually 99% of the time work for the patricians. And again, you have this, especially in the early republic, you have this constant conflict between the plebeians and the patricians about representation within the government. Now, eventually, you'll begin to see the Roman Republic kind of form around this law system known as the 12 Tables. Now, this law system is a very basic method of law, very, very similar to the Code of Hammurabi, but nevertheless, you have this 12 Tables as being established as the kind of foundation of the laws of this new republic. Now, the structure of the new republic itself is actually fairly simple if you actually, you know, sit down and look at it, but I'm just going to kind of go over a few of the individuals here. Now, the official requirements are, for the most part, is that obviously, needless to say, these positions, particularly those of office, are given to, or at least open to, people who have served more than 10 years in the Roman military. Okay, so in order to be any position within the Roman Republic, you have to be a veteran of the Roman military for at least 10 years. Now, probably the two most important positions within the Republic are the consuls. If you see here, the consuls, there's always two of them, and they each have a different purpose. The first one is it basically handles the administration, the day-to-day affairs of the Republic. The other handles the military affairs. Okay? So you have these two consuls serving short terms, usually of 2 years each, sometimes 4, but nevertheless, you essentially have these consuls kind of serving as the main functions of government. Just so I'm clear, because again, I can't hear any of you, am I making sense? Everything sounding okay? Okay, if I get choppy or the audio breaks up, just let me know, okay? Now, obviously, probably one of the most important aspects of the Republic itself is the Senate. Now, the Senate itself doesn't necessarily have any power, or at least direct power, within the Republic. In other words, it is the consuls who kind of drive the administration of the Republic, But the Senate does have an incredibly important position. It controls the Treasury. So what this means is that the consuls cannot actively, just do whatever they want, because they need the permission, or at least the money, that the Senate controls. Right? So itself, again, technically the Senate itself does not necessarily propose legislation or enforce legislation. That's the job of the councils, but the Senate does control the Treasury, which again, nothing gets done without these funds. Now, another important position here are the praetors. Now, the praetors have a pretty important position on their own. They serve as part-time judges and as part-time military officers. And so these praetors kind of serve both positions depending on the circumstances. All right, again, it's a very important position. Now, something I forgot to mention, but you need to take into account, is that all of these positions, whether they're senators, no, they basically serve as part-time judges and as part-time officers. So during war, they serve as military officers, but during peacetime, they serve judges. That's what I mean. Now, something I forgot to mention is that all of these positions, the senators, the consuls, the praetors, the quaesitors, all of these positions you see on the graph, to the right, they're all held by the patricians. So needless to say, this kind of really upsets the plebeians. And why not? Because again, all of a sudden they find themselves kicked out of government. Now, eventually you do begin to see more and more anger from the plebeians. And so in order to avoid basically a civil war, they come to a compromise. And the compromise comes into the form of the tribunes. Now, the tribunes, it says here that there's between 2 and 10 in number, but 99% of the time it's 10. So there's 10 tribunes. And even though they don't vote with the Senate, even though they don't have any power themselves, they have a very, very important role within society. Does anyone else have the audio issues that Amy does? Amy, you might want to check your audio, because it seems like you might be the only one who has any issues. Now,
no, I don't.
Okay, so good. All right. I'm sorry. Yeah, you might want to double check that you're allowing Zoom to kind of share your audio. Very good. Thank you, Nitram. Now, so in regard to the tribunes, they have the right to veto. Now, can anyone tell me what veto is? What is the power of veto? V-E-T-O. I just saw that it said it's spelled better. No, it's veto. Good. I mean, it basically means it has the power to reject legislation. Okay, so the councils oftentimes will go to the Senate and say, we want to do this. The Senate votes on it, but even before the Senate, well, even if the Senate says, yeah, this sounds good, it has to go through the tribunes. And the tribunes decide whether or not to go along with it. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of power for that particular individual, for these particular individuals, I should say. Now, in the early republic, or even in the later republic, I should say, the wealth of the patricians becomes incredibly important, because patricians are tribunes are strictly plebs. They're strictly for the plebeian class. All right, very good question, Monica. Now, the patricians all got these positions through the use of their wealth. As a matter of fact, it is expected. If you're a consul, if you're a senator, you're supposed to pay for things for the greater Roman good. Now, what this means is, I'm sure that you've all seen that okay movie, Gladiator. No, it's actually a fairly entertaining movie. But all those magnificent structures, the bathhouses, the coliseums, all the road networks, they're not built with government funds. Like public project works projects are done today. Instead, they're all built using the wealth of the patricians. And so, in order to get into politics, you're expected to pay. You're expected to dole out money, all right, to show your opulence and to show your contributions to the health of Rome, right? And so, it is expected that yes, if you're going to be a member of government, yes, it comes with benefits and it comes with, I guess, what you would call today corruption, but it's also expected that you're supposed to hand out money in the form of giving to the poor, in the form of building a new bathhouse or a statue to Jupiter, one or the other. You have to spend money. Now, how these positions are filled. Let's say, for example, that a praetorian position here is in need of filling. You often find assemblies. Now, think of these assemblies as kind of a very early form of a political party, much like this, for example, the Democrats, Republicans. These assemblies kind of figure out who exactly these positions fill. Now, the Centuria Assembly is the meeting of the patricians. The patricians, or at least the ruling class of the patricians, all gather together and they will kind of determine, okay, well, we need to fill this position in the Senate, or a council needs to be elected. This is how they do it in this particular assembly, in this meeting. Now, the plebeian assembly, needless to say, it's kind of the same thing. The plebeian assembly, it kind of is a meeting of the plebs where they pick who they vote for. All right, their vote is simply just called the plebiscite. Now, the tribal is actually a combination of the both, where the plebeians and the patricians get together and elect particular positions of the Senate. Now, one quick thing I want to bring up that will become important later on is the issue of the dictator. Now, the dictator, if you notice here, it means absolute power for a maximum of 6 months. So in times of crises, Rome basically shuts down its government. Now, can anyone guess why is this even a thing? Why would Rome kind of shut its representative government down and give power to a dictator? Can anyone throw a guess? Anyone want to, anyone know why? Yeah, I mean, for war, you're absolutely right. But why would it be important to centralize power? And I think Joseph already has that answer here. Yeah, because unfortunately, representative governments, they take forever. I mean, look at today, where you have the representative government that we have today talking about the stimulus package. If you've been following the news, that includes this check that people are supposed to get. It took quite some time for it to pass. But then even then, the wheels of bureaucracy, as we keep on mentioning, it's going to be another month before any of us see, these stimulus checks. So the Romans recognize this. And so in order to avoid, the wheels of bureaucracy slowing down during times of crisis when you need to make decisions right there and then, they decided to have this provision of giving absolute power to a dictator. Now, the use of a dictator in the early republic itself is actually very limited. And actually, one of my heroes of all time, his name is Cincinnatus, which, let's see if I can text here. Cincinnatus. Does anyone see that? Cincinnatus is one of my all-time heroes because he was this Roman general, a great warrior. He retires to his chicken farm outside of Rome. And eventually there's an invasion of a nomadic peoples, and they're unstoppable. And so the Roman Senate decides to pretty much just give Cincinnatus, this old retired general, dictatorial powers. So they go to him, and they say, hey, we really need you to make a comeback and help us defeat the Gauls who have invaded. Cincinnatus goes, well, I don't know. I don't know who's going to take care of my chickens. But eventually they decide to give him his power, and he does. He kind of rallies the troops, he defeats the Gauls, and at the end of it, he pretty much hands over power back to the Senate and then goes back to his chicken farm. It takes a tremendous individual to just give up power like that. And again, but as we'll see later on, this is incredibly limited. What I mean by this is that this act of honor by Cincinnatus will, it's a very rare thing, because eventually what you'll see is other individuals use this dictatorial power for their own glory. Okay, so something that we've talked a lot about this, but I'm just going to kind of review. Now, remember, Rome, even in its early history, continues to expand its influence. It continues to expand its influence and its power, and you begin to see kind of this expansion, as you can see here, by starting in 2090, the region of Umbria, Saninum, Apulia. So by, let's say, 270 BCE, you begin to see them eventually kind of unifying the entire peninsula under their control. Now, the interesting thing about Rome as it expands is that it does something incredibly unique, which is it gives citizenship, partial citizenship, to the people it's conquered. As long as you behave, as long as you contribute to us, you will have temporary citizenship. And if you just keep up the good behavior, it'll eventually turn into full-time citizenship. Now, please remember that, because this is incredibly important. All right, now, as they expand, they also expand the road network. Now, if you all remember from our conversation about the Romans, about the Persians spent a significant amount of time building a pretty impressive road network, or at least updating the already established road network, because they realized in order to maintain such a successful empire, communication is absolutely necessary. And so the Romans spent a significant amount of time and effort essentially building a pretty effective road network that, quite frankly, is still being used in many parts of Europe to this day. Now, as Rome continues to expand, it eventually comes into contact with the Carthaginians. Now, if you all remember, the Carthaginians are the descendants of Phoenician traders who have built a pretty successful city-state on their own, occupying or conquering much of North Africa, these Italian islands here, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and much of what we now call Spain. Now, needless to say, these two expansive imperial powers will eventually come into conflict with one another in a series of 3 wars known as the Punic Wars. Now, the first Punic War, just very quickly, sees the success of Rome and eventually conquers the island of Sicily. Now, this is a very important point in Roman history, because this is the first time that Rome has territory outside of Italy. So if you notice here, this is the first time that they've conquered anything outside of the Italian boot. And so the Romans really don't know what to do, and eventually decide to expand, or at least give the authority to administer the empire or at least this part of this new empire, to the Senate. And so the Senate now has control over how Sicily is managed, which is an important part of this kind of provincial system, right? This is the first, but certainly not the least, kind of new territory that Rome acquires outside of Italy. Now, the Second Punic War is probably the most famous of these wars, only because you have the emergence of the Carthaginian general Hannibal. If you all know the story, the Carthaginian general Hannibal led an army, including a few dozen elephants, from Spain all the way across the Alps mountains here, and wreaks havoc onto Italy. But despite his successes, Rome nonetheless continues to win victory after victory, and eventually wins the Second Punic War. And again, by the Third Punic War, it's just basically finishing off Carthage, right? And eventually Carthage and all of North Africa falls under the control of the Roman Republic itself. Now, these wars of expansion, not just against Carthage, but eventually you begin to see them against the Greeks, against other peoples, particularly the what is now the Gauls and what is now France. They do take a toll. Now, what I mean by that is that now the Romans at this point in time do not have a professional full-time army, which means that they do not employ just soldiers. These are part-time soldiers who are usually farmers during the off season, so to speak. Excuse me. And so because of this, because of these constant wars, you have more and more farmers being drawn from their fields to serve in the Roman army. And what this means, of course, is that without farmers attending to their crops, there's less food. And so you begin to see decline in food production, where all of a sudden now you begin to see a serious issue of the Romans not being able to grow enough food for their people. All right. In addition, all right, many of these small farmers, because they're not able to grow food or at least supply food so they can feed themselves and keep their farms going, eventually many of them lose their farms because they can't pay their taxes. Right now, because of this, the wealthy patricians in the countryside begin gobbling up the poor farmers' lands who can't pay their taxes, and eventually begin to see these massive estates, these massive, I guess what you would call the precursor to an hacienda in Spanish, the latifundia. Right now, again, these are the massive real estate holdings of the wealthy, and so again, you begin to see, if you remember, I keep on mentioning this, but it's important that we talk about this gap between the wealthy and the poor, what we call disparity, continues to grow, right? And so again, this is, while Rome is winning all these victories and getting all this territory, it is also setting the stage for something bad to happen, right? Especially with the resentment of the poor. Now, is everyone following along so far? Any questions?
No, of course.
Okay, so with this instability, with food production, declining, with this growing resentment among the plebeians, you begin to see patricians actually taking the side of the plebeians. Now, you could see this one of two ways. You could see it in a very optimistic way that the patricians knew that they were screwing over the working class and were sympathetic to their cause, or you could see it in the cynical way that they were just taking advantage of the mob. Now, one of the things that I appreciate about that movie, Gladiator, is its emphasis on the mob. Now, the mob just means the people of Rome. And so, and the power that they hold. So you could look at it one way or another, and I'm sure there are people who were genuinely sympathetic to the cause of the plebeians, but then there are others who clearly just, using it for their own political gain. Now, one of the earliest, or two of the earliest of these wealthy individuals taking the side of the plebeians are the Gracchus brothers. Tiberius Gracchus was, again, a successful Roman general who begins using his victories on the battlefield to earn political power in Rome. But again, during this time, he becomes incredibly sympathetic to the plight of the plebs, and he begins to gain their sympathy and their support. Now, the other patricians around him begin to feel a little bit nervous, because they kind of see what he's doing, seeing that he's being able to kind of control all this power with the support of the public. And so eventually a conspiracy is formed, and Tiberius Gracchus himself is murdered. Now, his brother Gaius, he continues kind of his brother's, this quest, or this crusade to support the plebs. And he began, kind of using his brother's death to his advantage. He forms this group, this organization, to hunt down corruption within the Roman Republic. All right, and he calls them the Equites, or the Equestrians. And so these equestrians were this group of patricians who, like him, were dedicated in hunting down the corruption and the evildoers of Roman society. And you'll see this a lot during this period in time, is individuals claiming to be fighting corruption in Rome at this point. Now, despite Gaius's following, despite his, this swearing and oath to hunt down corruption, much like his brother, Gaius himself is also murdered as well. Now, despite the murder of the Gracchus brothers, they nonetheless kind of paved the way for this new method of thinking. Now, within the patrician class, you begin to see two subclasses forming: the populares and the optimates. The populares are the patricians who support the plight of the plebs. They support the plight of the commoners, the mob, while the optimates support the plight of themselves, support the plight of the wealthy. Now, another kind of thing that happens during this period of time is you begin to see Roman generals becoming more and more ambitious and becoming personalities of their own. And a perfect example of this is Gaius Marius. Now, Gaius Marius is a Roman general, very successful, but what you begin to see happening is you begin to see his armies, who again originally are supposed to swear loyalty to the Roman Republic, but instead are swearing loyalty to these generals. All right, so how this happens and why this happens is you begin to see, well, usually what happens with Rome is when it conquers a new area, it plunders. In other words, you go into a new region and the Roman army basically gathers up any type of wealth, whether in the form of animals, whether in the form of gold, whether in the form of slaves. That's pretty much what they're after. And what these generals begin doing is they send a portion of it to Rome, they keep a portion for themselves, but they also begin giving the portions of it to their armies. And so needless to say, this is going to cause a lot of sympathy for these generals. And so these client armies begin to become more loyal to their respective generals than they are to the Republic. All right, now Marius will eventually use these armies to begin forming political power in Rome. All right, now again, despite the fact that Marius is the one who first does it, it is his disciple, one of his proteges, Sulla, that really truly does begin the process of kind of taking this power to the extreme. Now, Sulla's story really does begin during the Social War. Now, if y'all remember, I was telling you about the Italians, the non-Romans that Rome conquered in the 3rd century BCE. Now, remember, they were given partial citizenship and were promised full citizenship on the condition that they behave. Just follow our rule, contribute to our society, and in a few years we'll see what we can do for you. Well, that never happened. So if you notice here, many of these Italians had been partial citizens for the last 200 years, and they got tired of the Senate, dragging their heels, and eventually decided to just take matters into their own hands. And so you have a period in time here known as the Social War, where the Italians rebel against the Romans, right, because of this frustration. Now, the main commanding general against these Italian rebels is Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Now, Lucius Sulla not only is able to defeat the Italians in battle, he basically grants them citizenship. He gathers up the Italian. Yeah, these are basically non-Romans. These are partial citizens of the empire. And again, remember, they were promised citizenship. And so pretty much any Italian is anyone who lives here in Italy outside of Rome, who isn't a full Roman citizen. Now, Sulla defeats the Italians and does something very, very radical, which is grant them citizenship. He defeats them and says, you know what, you're absolutely right. Consider yourself full Roman citizens from this point on. That's not what the Senate had in mind. The Senate wanted to make an example of the Italians. And by example, I mean kill them all. Sulla doesn't see the benefit of that. And without any approval, without any orders, decides to just basically go along with just making them citizens. And so, yes, he decreed that, yes, even though he didn't have authority to, he gave them all citizens. So Rome, the Senate, calls Sulla back to basically answer for what he did. And Sulla returns to Rome, but at the head of a very loyal army, which is actually pretty controversial because this is the first time that a Roman army has ever entered the city of Rome, or at least one of the few times that a Roman army has ever entered the city of Rome. Right? It's always kind of been a forbidden thing for a Roman army to enter into Rome, but Sulla has done it. And this goes to show you just how powerful he is. And so Sulla arrives at the Senate with this army, and so all of a sudden the senators go, "Oh, hey, buddy, good job." And as a matter of fact, he convinces them very easily that Rome is under attack by internal enemies who want to see Rome, the Republic, destroyed. And so the only way to do this is to grant him, and the only way he can save Rome is to grant him dictatorial powers. Which is kind of ironic if you think about it. The only way to save a republic is by making someone a dictator. Now, so Sulla, he begins the process of supposedly hunting down Rome's enemies, hunting down the people who are, the corrupt politicians, the incompetent individuals who are destroying the republic from within. Now, this process is known as proscription. Now, unfortunately, this process of proscription is very controversial. Let's say, for example, because again, you can pretty much name names and no one's going to question it. There's no trial. There's no, interviewing of witnesses. All of a sudden, let's just use the example of, let's say, for example, that Jonathan, is jealous of his neighbor Emily's property. She has a nicer house, has nicer holdings. Her cows are nicer. And so Jonathan could just basically go to authorities and say, "Yeah, I heard Emily talking bad about Sulla the other day." And in the middle of the night, they just arrest her. And as a reward, they'll give Jonathan Emily's property. So this is how messed up this is. And this is what we call proscription, supposedly this process of purging Rome of its enemies, but in reality, it's just basically a very, very corrupt method of terror. Yes, I'm sure you are, Jonathan. Now, Sulla becomes dictator he becomes dictator for quite some time until he eventually decides to retire, and he hands over the reins of power to one particular person in general, Gnaeus Pompey. Now, Pompey is Sulla's probably most trusted general, and he begins the process of, I guess, where he really kind of becomes a superstar within the Roman people is during the reign of Spartacus, the revolt of Spartacus. Has anyone ever seen that old movie with Kirk Douglas? Yeah, with Kirk Douglas. That's from the 60s. So yeah, Pompey. So just a little background story for those of you who've never heard of what I'm talking about. Has anyone ever seen the it was a series not that long ago on Stars? Um, Apparently it was very graphic, if that's the word I can use. I never actually saw it, but yeah. Is it on Netflix? I'm afraid to watch it. I'm sorry, I can't watch anything on Netflix right now aside from Tiger King. That show is mortifyingly awesome. Yes. I was actually telling my wife the other day that she, I can't, there are a bunch of horrible people in that show, and she comes off as the most horrible. which is just weird because they're felons and potential murderers, and meth addicts, and she comes off as the most horrible. But I was very, very tempted to start off this lecture by saying, hey, y'all, cats, cool cats and kittens, but I'm not going to do that. Now, this is the last time I'm going to comment on this, and we're going to go back to lecture. Apparently, it turns out that that's not his music. He paid some band out of Washington State in order to do his music. So he just lip syncs. I don't mean to ruin that for you, but yeah. All right. So going back to very important things, so Pompey begins the process, like I said, where he becomes most famous is during the revolt of Spartacus. Now, Spartacus was an ex-slave, a gladiator to be specific, who leads a very, very large revolt of slaves in Italy, and actually wins various battles against Roman armies. Now, eventually, Spartacus is defeated, and just a little bit of background. Spartacus, along with 25,000 of his followers, were eventually defeated and captured by Pompey. And in order to avoid any other future slave revolts, and remember, Rome has a substantial slave population, and so for the Roman Republic, it was important for Pompey to send them a message that revolts like this will not be tolerated. And they did this by taking Spartacus and all 25,000 of his followers and crucifying them along the Appian Way. Now, the Appian Way, just FYI, I'm not going to test you on this, is a road that leads from Rome all the way down to the boot of Italy. And so he and 25,000 of his followers were all crucified along this road as a kind of a warning to future slaves that this is what happens when you revolt against Rome. Now, after this revolt was put down, Pompey, needless to say, becomes a superstar. And eventually, he gets yes, he did. He was kind of the general behind the defeat of Spartacus's revolt. And so Pompey uses his celebrity, his popularity, to eventually get himself elected consul. Now, remember, consul usually only serve 2 to 4 years, usually 2. So, but eventually he gets elected quite a few number of times. Basically, becomes a consul for quite some time. Now, when Sulla eventually decides to retire, he decides that pretty much, despite Pompey's popularity, there's another rising general within the Roman military that is becoming even more popular, or even just as popular as Pompey, which of course I'm talking about Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar, again, like I said before, was a celebrity into his own. He had basically conquered the entirety of Gaul. If you see here on the map, the entirety of what is now France and Belgium, practically on his own, and even launches a semi-successful invasion of Britain. No, Jonathan, Pompey means something else specifically. I'm not really sure what it means, but it's not named after him. But so Julius Caesar leads these campaigns, against the Gauls and conquers them. He leads an invasion of what is now England, at least for 4 years, but nevertheless becomes an incredibly popular individual. And so when Sulla retires, it is kind of decided that, yes, even though Rome is still a republic, it is now in the hands of 3 specific individuals: Pompey, Julius Caesar, and another individual, which I will text him right here, an individual named Crassus. Now, Crassus is an old general of Sulla, not as popular as Pompey or Caesar, but he is incredibly he's incredibly pragmatic. In other words, Pompey and Caesar quickly become rivals, but Crassus has always been very, middle of the road, you know, hey, let's, you know, let's work things out. You know, he's kind of the stabling force behind Roman government. But things become incredibly problematic when Crassus eventually dies in battle. And so this calming force within the Republic goes away. And so you have the collapse of the triumvirate, and eventually you have a civil war between Caesar and Pompey, which eventually results in Pompey's defeat and eventual death. And eventually Caesar becomes the sole source of power within um, within the Republic. Now, during this time, all of a sudden now now Caesar himself is a populare. He is an incredibly successful populare. Not only does he advocate for the poor, he also provides free bread and food. He also provides circuses being the main source of entertainment at the time. And you know, gladiator um, gladiator bouts, et cetera, et cetera. And so he himself, again, Caesar becomes incredibly popular. He becomes incredibly well liked by the people. Now, there is a rumor. Now, whether or not this is true or not, it's very, very it's very controversial. But supposedly there's a rumor that Caesar was going to declare himself Rex. Does anyone want to take a guess of what this word is? R-E-X. And by the way, Aaron, I see yes, he was decapitated. Now it's probably, yeah, remember the word Rex is the word, it's where the Spanish word today, rey, comes from, R-E-Y. So it's the same thing. You're very good. But going back to Aaron's question, yes, he was decapitated, but more than likely he was done after his death. But you know, just details. So there's a rumor going around that Caesar is going to declare himself Rex. Which, remember, the Roman Republic is incredibly, let's call it, Rex is very much not okay. And so with Rex, I mean, with this in mind, you begin to see this conspiracy forming, where all of a sudden, even his closest friends are looking at each other and going, we may have to do something about Caesar's ambition. And so eventually, in the Ides of March, does anyone know when the Ides of March is? It's a particular day, and every month has it. The Ides of October, the Ides of December. Very good, Monica. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar is assassinated by several members of the Senate. Okay, and all of a sudden, things get really, really weird within the Republic. Any questions so far? '44 BCE. So honestly, I don't know the details. You know, it's just, you know, honestly, most people's details of what happened with the Senate, it comes from the Shakespeare play. Um, Now, I'm not sure, I never actually looked into how accurate that is, but if it's anything similar to that, which again, Shakespeare did use primary source analysis, Julius Caesar was about to give a speech in the Senate. Yes, correct, 44 BCE. So Julius Caesar was about to give a speech to the Senate, and eventually he's met by a group of senators. They kind of gathered around him, thinking that, you know, they were, you know, just, hey, how are you doing? Congratulations. And then they eventually just stab him. Now, if again, whether or not, now according to the Shakespearean play, his best friend in the Senate, Brutus, was the last one to actually stab him. That's where the famous line, "Et tu, Brute," you know, Caesar's last word supposedly, which means, yes, thank you, Kimberly. And you too, Brutus. Um, I'm sure that was for dramatic effect. More than likely, Caesar probably didn't survive the first wave of, of, of shankings, as we say it back in the battery. Now, with Caesar's death, needless to say, things are very, very crazy. So those individuals who had murdered Caesar eventually go into hiding, and several members of Caesar's closest entourage kind of come together, and they eventually form a triumvirate of their own. Now, at the head of this triumvirate is Mark Antony. Mark Antony was one of Caesar's most trusted generals. He had during this Roman civil war that Caesar fought against Pompey. He had, as a matter of fact, one of the big motivators of Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, as we'll talk about in a minute, was the hunting down and execution of Caesar's murderers. Yes, most of them were eventually caught and arrested and eventually executed for his murder. Now, Mark Antony, again, this trusted general had actually conquered Egypt for Rome. And during this time, well, at first he went with Caesar. Caesar had fallen in love with Cleopatra the seventh, the famous Cleopatra. There's quite a few of them. Actually, Caesar actually has a son with Cleopatra, but eventually when Caesar returns to Rome, Mark Antony stays behind, and eventually they get married themselves. So Mark Antony, Lepidus, another old trusted general of Caesar, becomes another member of the triumvirate, and then Octavian Caesar. Now, Octavian is Caesar's adopted son. So again, Octavian is the adopted son of Caesar, and he does not look, according to the sources, he does not look like this. If you see him, this is Octavian here. He looks very healthy, fit, very competent. He's actually pretty, according to the record, he's actually pretty scrawny. He's probably like 5'1", and he's very thin, and he's always sick. But nevertheless, you can't judge a book by its cover. He is a very, very effective ruler. Now, eventually, what you do begin to see happening is much like the previous triumvirate, you begin to see robberies happen between Antony and Octavian. Now, eventually, Lepidus. Now, remember, Lepidus kind of served the same kind of role as previous, where it's kind of pragmatic. Hey, let's all calm down, etc., etc. But then eventually, Lepidus is pushed into retirement, and eventually, Antony and Octavian, much like Caesar and Pompey before, go to war. And the second Roman Civil War eventually results in kind of culminates, comes together at this final epic battle of Actium, which Octavian's forces defeat Mark Antony's forces in 31 BCE. Both Mark Antony and Octavian both commit suicide, and Octavian is the last man standing, so to speak. Now, back at Rome, they hear about Octavian's big victory, and all of a sudden everyone is very nervous, because remember, the last time that a Caesar walked into Rome, there was rumors that he was trying to make himself king. And so everyone hears that Octavian is coming back to Rome, and so everyone's holding their breath about what exactly is going to happen to the Republic. What happens is that Octavian comes back to Rome and pretty much tells the Senate, I am not here to make myself king, I am here to restore the Republic. Right? And so this was a big sigh of relief to the Roman Republic. All of a sudden, Octavian comes in and says, "I'm just here to restore the Republic. The Republic's been kind of wavering for the last 100 years. I'm here to give power back to the people." Now, on paper, all right, this is exactly what happened. The Senate and the Republic entity itself was was still kind of given power back, and in return, Octavian is given the title of Augustus. Now, the term Augustus itself is a ceremonial concept, right? It's just a title that is given to them, but more importantly, he's also given the title of Protector of the Roman Republic. And along with this title, along with this position, he basically is in command of the Roman military. All right. And so not only is he given the ceremonial title of Augustus, he's also given the title of Princeps, which is another old, yes, correct. So it's Augustus Octavian Caesar. So this title of Princeps is the closest thing you can do with to give someone a title without naming them Rex. And again, Caesar, I mean Octavian, Augustus. Now we'll call him that. The Roman general previously known as Octavian is now Augustus. Augustus, he spent the rest of his life trying to pretty much convince people he was just another person. He never dressed in very opulent clothes like that. He always dressed in, by the way, just FYI, just to ruin it for you, Romans did not dress in togas. The Senate did as kind of their ceremonial uniform, but regular Romans wore regular clothes. They really didn't dress in togas because togas are stupid. As a matter of fact, foreign dignitaries visiting Rome in the Senate, the first thing they commented is how stupid those togas were. So yes, I've ruined togas for you. Good. Now, if you want to wear, no, because I was the guy who always ruined the toga parties and went, no, if you want to dress like Romans, just wear regular clothes. Yeah, I was the bummer. So, Octavian's source of power really comes from two things. And let's ignore the foreign for now. Let's focus on the army. The first thing that Octavian does in this new position as Augustus is create a permanent full-time military, right? And he does so. No more part-time soldiers, no more, basically a National Guard where they're part-time farmers, part-time soldiers. No, we're going to have a full-time army. And how he pays for this, it's actually a pretty clever thing. He creates what is known as an inheritance tax. In other words, when patricians die, they leave their inheritance, their fortune, to their family members. Now, Caesar says, and again, I use this word Caesar because this will become important later on. Augustus says, now when a patrician dies and leaves inheritance, we're going to take half of it. We, meaning the Roman government. And so this actually does two things. Not only does it pay for this full-time military, it also wins some points with the plebs, right? Because the plebeians love this, right? And so this inheritance tax kills two birds with one stone. It forms a permanent full-time military, but it also wins points with the plebs, which he needs their support. In addition to creating the full-time military, we also have the creation of the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard serves two purposes. First, it serves as a personal bodyguard of the Roman of what will become the Roman emperors. Now, I want to make it very clear that all historians, most historians, will point to Augustus Caesar, Octavian, and say he is the first of the Roman emperors. That's technically true, but keep in mind that remember that the position of emperor, the Latin term imperator, does not come until much later. So yes, even though he's the first one, remember, officially the Republic is still a thing, right? There's still a representative form of government. He just happens to be kind of behind the scenes in many ways. But nevertheless, again, you do have that kind of obscure, weird position. So he creates a Praetorian Guard not only to, again, like I mentioned before, serve as his bodyguard. It's basically the police force of the city of Rome, right? The city of Rome itself. So again, the two purposes of the Praetorian Guard, to protect the Roman emperors and to serve as a police force. Now, just FYI, a little funny side note, the Praetorian Guard will be later on in Roman history will be responsible for quite a few deaths of Roman emperors. In other words, they basically decide, yeah, we don't like this guy, and they end up killing him. Sometimes they did. Other times they didn't. And I'll explain that a little bit later, Samantha. The baby here, it's actually a Roman motif. My art history is a little shady, or not shady, but a little off. but the baby itself is actually a thing in Roman history. I'm not really sure what it means, but I'll actually look it up. Um, so Monica, to answer your question um, about they're it's not like the special forces or the Green Berets where they're kind of the best of the best in a sense. The Praetorian Guards positions were, in other words, most of them were of importance, of noble birth, and so that pretty much gave them the position. So it wasn't because they were, exceptional in combat or anything else like that. A lot of these were just kind of cush positions for the sons of wealthy individuals, what we call in Spanish hijos de papi. Now, what I'm going to do here is just briefly kind of go over a couple of emperors. Now, I'm not going to make you remember the dates and the times, whatever. I'm just going to go over the list of emperors from the death of Augustus all the way down. Tiberius, Augustus's adopted son, eventually becomes emperor. He is a pretty functional emperor for a time until we believe, and we historians believe, that he fell into depression and eventually just stopped functioning. Now, eventually, his own adopted son, Caligula, becomes. Now, remember, keep in mind that Caligula is merely just a nickname. That's not really his name. Has anyone ever heard of Caligula before? Um, Caligula is a very interesting individual. Now, like I mentioned before, that's not really his name. His full name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. I'm not going to make you remember that. Caligula in Latin literally means little boots. So when he was little, he used to march around with the soldiers, and the soldiers gave him that nickname because he used to dress up like in a little uniform, and he eventually he began wearing the uniform and the little boots, and they would call him Caligula, meaning little boots, which apparently he hated. But Caligula, he, uh, he's one of the more controversial figures in Roman history, only because of the weirdness around his reign. For example, there's a rumor going around that he often had incestuous affairs with his mother, who he later on eventually murdered, with his sisters. There was one point apparently that his favorite ship, was destroyed in a storm, and so he decided to declare war on not Poseidon, it's Saturn. Uh, Saturn. No, Saturn is no Jupiter. That's one. No, Neptune. Neptune. Thank you, Samantha. He declares war on Neptune and sends a Roman legion out into the beach and orders the Roman legion to attack the water, attack the Mediterranean. So the Roman soldiers just apparently stood out there and just stabbed the water with their spears and their swords. Um, so let me kind of preface this by basically saying that we don't have a lot of primary source records of Caligula's life. And eventually, he is one of the first, not the last, but one of the first emperor. He's the first emperor to actually get assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. And so we think there's a possibility that Caligula's weirdness, and there is a lot of it. I will encourage you to go online. And actually, what I'll do is I'll post up, articles and whatever on the announcements from now on. I'll post up just kind of an example of his weirdness, and you can see for yourself. But the thing I was going to say is that this is entirely possible that what they did is after his death, his enemies, to justify their murder of him, just pretty much made all this stuff up. Because who's going to argue that, hey, guy declared war on a god, is a good emperor. So there is a possibility that all of this stuff is just made up to make him look bad. Now, from what we could tell, he wasn't that good of an emperor, but was he psychotic? In other words, there's stories of him literally painting himself in gold and walking the streets of Rome and forcing people to worship at his feet. Is that true? We really don't know. Now, Caligula, like I said before, eventually will be murdered assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in 41 BCE. I'm sorry, not 41 BC, 41 CE. Now, in a sense, no, this is what I'm telling you, is that all these stories are not verified. These are stories that were written by people who were his enemies. So does that make them? I mean, we can't say for absolutely certain that he didn't do any of these things. And this is why, no, his assassination, yeah, that's absolutely the thing. But like the weird stories about him. This is what I keep telling you in class about. Yes, while primary sources are our main source of information, all right, we cannot just entirely rely on those. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is Nero, who's one of my favorite emperors. By favorite, I mean he was one of the worst. Now, he was a weird guy, and that is absolutely verified. So how I like to describe him is he is basically the Roman version of Kanye West. If I can make that comparison, where he really thought that he was a genius. He thought that. So he was a poet. He was a musician. He was a playwright. He would make plays. He would create dramas, and apparently they were all terrible. But he really thought that he was this, this aficionado, this gift of Roman culture. But also he was a pretty bad emperor. And I'm not going to focus on the reign, whatever, but I'm just going to get into one of my favorite things to talk about is how he actually, like, his last days. Now, eventually, much like Caligula, his reign eventually is kind of brought down by his own incompetence, and eventually a conspiracy forms around him, and eventually he's overthrown from power. He's able to escape Rome before he's killed, and makes his way to a small town a few miles outside of Rome. And he tries to make his escape. But he begins to realize that he's not going to be able to escape that death, that they're gonna find him and they're gonna murder him. And so he is with a small group of loyal servants, slaves, and maybe about 3 or 4 of them. And he kind of comes to the realization he's going to die. But he says, okay, listen, I'm probably going to not make it, but I don't want to get captured because they're going to torture and kill me. So I need one of you to kill me. In other words, just take my life and make it quick. And of course, the servants are like, no, we're not going to kill you. Like, why would we do that? And it's like, okay, well then, I'm just going to kill myself. So there's a nearby river, and he tries to get in, but it's one of those things where he kind of tippy toes in and says, no, it's too cold. I can't kill myself that way. And so he goes back to one of the servants, and he says, he tells him, okay, well, I need one of you to slit your own throat. So that way, we can, so that way you just show me how it's like. So that way, maybe I'll do it, maybe not. And so he's basically asking one of his servants to kill themselves so he can see how it looks. And yeah, the servants are like, no. And as a matter of fact, they're like, no, let's just, I'll just, the servants, instead of saying, all of a sudden the servants who didn't want to kill him, all of a sudden are being told, okay, well, just kill yourself and let me see how it looks. Then the servants go, okay, well, we'll just kill you. And so one of the servants grabs a knife and holds it to Caesar, and to say Caesar, because technically he is. The title of Caesar is one that will transfer over for the rest of the empire. And so according to the source, Nero, the last words he said before his own servant slit his own throat is, "Oh, what a artist the world is about to lose," which I always thought was weird.